I'm Wayne Tuttle, and welcome to Chasing Legends. Thanks for joining us this week. I'm going to get into the bark notes again, but before I do, please hit subscribe, hit the notifications bell. Join us anytime, leave a comment or no comment or anything at all. Understand we can only reply to the ones that we get that allow us to reply, because if you write complete gibberish or you don't know how to spell basic words, it becomes very difficult because the algorithm will not put it in. For whatever reason, you would think it would put anything in, but it doesn't. It'll actually kick it out. So sometimes when it takes a bit of a delay before we answer your comments or like or find, because we're having a difficult to find time finding them, we have to go back and then bring them and then approve of them to be put in there. So that's all on Trevor's side. Please pick up the Legend of the Superstition Mountain t-shirts and the Dutch Hunter Rendezvous shirts. We got them both in black and gray short sleeve and long sleeve now. This week we're going to touch upon a story. I'm going to just read through and just keep this very simple as we kind of come into the fall and the holiday season. And this one is The Two Soldiers. So it's going to actually incorporate some other stories, because this story, I think, involves some of the story with John Tuning and Joe Deering and all that, which we touched upon basically, I think, in the last episode. In the last episode, I think we touched upon John Tuning briefly. I think he was with Jim Bark, and while he was working with Jim Bark when he ran into Silver Locket Mountain. But here we go. Let's kind of delve into this and get ourselves through the Two Soldiers story. Sometime in the early days of the Silver King, there were two soldiers discharged at Fort McDowell. They refused transportation back east to their place of enlistment, as they wanted to stay out west and go to work in the mines. The wages were much higher than they could get in the east for any work, so they struck out for the king afoot. When they got to Pinal, they went into the superintendent's office and applied for work. Aaron Mason was the superintendent, and he asked if they were miners. They told him they were not. Well, he said, I suppose you can muck? They wanted to know what that was, and he told them it was shoveling ore, filling buckets, and any kind of work around the mine except active mining. They said that's what they expected to do at least for a while. Mason told them to go up to the king and report to the foreman, Bob Bowen, and he would put them to work. One of them put his hand in his coat pocket, pulled out a handful of nuggets, and asked Mason what this was. He told them it was gold, and they said, "Oh, you are fooling." Mason told them that they could trade it in at the company store up at the King for $60 an ounce for anything in the store. So they went up, and sure enough, they could cash it in for anything the store had. They bought 2 burros and a pack saddles, bedding, grub, etc., and to the tune of $84, packed up and started back for their mine. Passing through Pinal, they stopped at the superintendent's office and asked Mason if he would keep this gold that they had wrapped in a rag for them until their return. Mason weighed it and placed it in a fruit jar, put a slip of paper in it with their 2 names and the amount, and $800 and some odd dollars, and put it in the safe. My authority for this was Wiley Holman, who sometimes lived at Pinal following mining, and then he would change and go to cow punching. He was considered as truthful as a combined miner and cowpuncher could be. Wiley told me that he had seen the gold and had discussed it with Mason on different occasions. Years after, he had written Mrs. Mason in New York regard to the gold. She replied that she had such a jar with the 2 names in it, that a mining friend had told her there was about $300 worth of gold in the jar, and that it was subject to the owner's claim. Now Mason asked the 2 soldiers if they didn't want a partner, and they told him the following story. They said they were discharged soldiers from the Fort McDowell and decided to come to the king to see if they could get work in the mine. So they struck out toward the king, crossed the Salt River, and crossed a trail which they had been told was the proper one to take, and which is now called the Apache Trail. But it is now an automobile road. They followed it for several miles to a creek crossing where there was water. The trail after that appeared to run nearly north, and the king was nearly south, so while they felt certain that the trail would eventually land them at the king, it must be a long way around, and they were tired. They decided to make a shortcut and went up this creek for some distance, came to a waterfall, and could go no further. They came back down the creek and finally got out on the side of the creek towards the king, and up on a very rough high mountain. There was no trail, They struck out, always trying to work their way to their destination, but making very slow progress. Then they ran upon a trail in such a queer place for a trail. They concluded to follow it and see if it wouldn't lead them out of this God-forsaken country. They followed it but a short distance, and they were in high hopes when the trail led them through a cave between the peaks. It must have been a foot trail, as animals would not go through a cave. They went on a little further and came to a tunnel that had been walled up, while with workings above and over. They said that they did not believe what they saw was gold, as there was so much of it. They said they certainly could load their burros down to the water line. They told Mason they had never taken out their naturalization papers, and if they would go over to Tucson with them and help them get out their papers upon their return, which would be not more than 10 days, he could go with them to the mine. That they would take just one claim and he could locate all the balance. Mason said all right, and that he would look for their return. Okay, now this is kind of the midst of the story, and everyone in here, outside of the soldiers whose names were never revealed off the slips of paper, but all the people in particulars in here, yeah, there was, Aaron and Bob Owen and all these people, very real people that worked at these mines and discussed this story, I think, at length later. In each saloon in the mining camps was a lunch counter, owned and presided over by a Chinaman, and the food served was very superior to what they served at the lunch counters in the mining towns of today. It was considered an awful thing for any of the employees of one saloon to eat even once at the lunch counter of another. There was very seldom a reason doing so, and if it was reported that a Chinaman soon found out a buyer and there was a change, or else the employee found a job somewhere else. The Chinaman was the source where the employee of the house would go when they were in need of a few dollars, but he would not loan a man the second time if he borrowed the money to gamble. He always figured he was capable of gambling his own money, and in reality he was. If he didn't approve of a man's conduct, he would be brutally frank in his method of collection. He would watch his opportunity and get his debtor a loan and say, "When you pay. I'm going to work at such and such game today, Monday. Jim, all Chinamen were named Charlie or Jim, then I pay you. You all times say that, no good." The gambler knew he had better buck up and cut out his drinking, as he probably owed quite a grub bill, as well as cash, but all his gamblers would rather borrow off of Charlie or Jim, as they did not consider they were under any obligation to the Chinamen except to pay it back, and they did not have to humiliate themselves by asking a fellow gambler for a loan, thereby disclosing their financial distress. The Chinamen held transactions of this kind as sacred. The lines of society were drawn just as tightly among the gamblers and their families as they were never or can be in our towns today. To continue, the two ex-soldiers then struck out for the mine and again told Mason they would not be gone for over 10 days. Soon thereafter, Clubfoot, who was, I think, believed the guy that they're referring to in the gambling situation there, disappeared from the king, and no one knew where he had gone or why. 10 days went by and no soldiers. 15, no soldiers. Then Clubfoot showed up. Evidently he had plenty of money, as he was betting $20 pieces at different games. Miners and gamblers became very suspicious. They got together and held a secret meeting, agreed that the next shift change they would hang Clubfoot and make him tell where he got his gold. Somehow it got to Clubfoot's ears and he disappeared. Just then it reached the king that the body of one of the soldiers had been found over in the mountains, lying alongside the trail by some cattlemen. Their manner of identification was his hat, which they sent to the sutler's store in Fort McDowell. He said it had been purchased by one of the discharged soldiers who had started afoot for the Silver King on a certain date, giving his name, which was correct. He had a bullet hole in his back and had been dead long enough so that the body was pretty well decomposed. Old man Whitlow, who was one of the men who found the body, said that there was a shod horse track on the trail leading over the mountain to the Superstitions. He said they just dug a shallow hole, rolled the body into it, covered it with what little dirt they had, piled rocks on the grave, and let it go at that. This grave was shown to me by one of the Whitlow boys. It was about a quarter mile above my ranch house. Hughes Ward and I dug it up and found nothing but bones and buttons, so we reburied him and covered the grave with rock. The grave is still there undisturbed. Bill Kimball of Mesa said that about the same time he saw the body of a man naked lying near Buff Spring. So he pulled out for Mesa immediately. Whether this was the other soldier is only conjecture, but I am inclined to think that it was, as there were very few white men traveling to the Superstition Mountains at the time. One thing for certain, neither of the soldiers was ever seen again. Now, very interesting story. It's a story that ties into Joe Deering, John Tuning, the man known as Clubfoot. We will kind of touch upon some of those stories later. Obviously, the Soldier's Grave, a lot of people get very interested in that. It's out past east of the Quarter Circle U. We went out a number of years ago. It had been kind of desecrated, I guess you would say it. People had kind of dismantled it and tried digging around that area. We basically, and I got photographs of a group of us. I know Randy Wright was with me, Paul Shimmick. We basically tried to restore it and restack the rock and brought in a lot more rock to try to kind of deter people. It's kind of a little bit out of the way, away from the trail. So we were hoping that people would start to leave it alone. The plan was, and we never did get back out to check, and one day I'll have to take Frank out, we'll have to check, was if people continue to try to dig in that area looking for buttons or bones or whatever, which is pretty disgusting in my opinion. And to those who have messed with that and done so in the past, I don't know what you're thinking, so be it, but hey, you wouldn't do it to your own grandmother. Why would you do it to this guy? But anyhow, we thought about bringing some bags of cement, and the next time pouring slop and slurry cement all over the rocks and try to just kind of let it be as what it is. So I haven't been out there. We'll have to go out there, maybe shoot a little video or something over at the site and all. I kind of try to stay away from it, because if there's no real trails or nothing really out of the ordinary, you would go by the trail. And like I said, it's a bit off the trail, probably 30 yards, 40 yards, and if you didn't know it was there, you probably wouldn't see it and probably wouldn't know it and just pass it by, which is the best. And I'd like to point out that Revis's headstone was stolen as well from his grave site. So it's kind of a shame there are people like that and do things like that. But Two Soldiers story, which opens up into so many other stories, like I keep repeating, the Joe Deering, the John Tuning story, the Clubfoot, and whatever, and these different stories that kind of pattern off of it. But I know there's been a lot of discussion. The gold jar for years and years and years, but it seemed to have disappeared from the family, and no one kept records of the names that were on the slips of paper. So we've always tried that. One thing that's kind of fascinating is the Two Soldiers story is kind of a general Americana type story. Even here locally, there's, for the South Mountain and the Estrella Mountains, with the Superstition Mountains, there are multiple Two Soldier stories. There's Two Soldier stories, two French-Canadian soldiers, two French soldiers. The Estrella Mountains have a Two Soldier story that they were French soldiers, and there was a mine up there, and that they had dug into, and I think they hit silver there. So it's a pretty common, when you hear the story Two Soldiers, I guess they maybe just traveled in pairs and it just became a general kind of knowledge thing. So anyways, that was the Bark Notes, the Two Soldier story, with a little extra thrown in there. And maybe later on down the line we'll go out to one of these places and we'll kind of do something a little more in depth, talking about some of the other things. But there's a lot of great research. You go back to the old Lost Dutchman forum and you'll find a lot of great stuff in the archives concerning especially this story, because a lot of people were very involved, doing a lot of great research, trying to dig into the story a bit, who the soldiers were and whatnot, and if there was any way we could pull anything out of it. Thank you for joining us this week, and as we continue to move through, hit subscribe, hit the notifications bell. Thank you for watching as always, and leaving your comments. We always try to answer everything we can. And until the next time, this is Wayne Tuttle, and thank you for watching Chasing Legends.